Howdy. The mic's working, right? Okay, so I'm from Texas. I need a response. Howdy. Great, it's good. Good to be here. From Dallas, so this is nice. It's home, although I actually live on the other side of the Metroplex in Fort Worth. It's basically like flying in from out of town in some ways. All right, so let me get this put together and we can start going. While I'm doing this, I'm going to talk a little bit about community. And so I'm involved in Dallas AI. Dallas AI is a meetup, not-for-profit meetup, where we talk about AI ML. And not surprisingly, we've been doing a lot of events recently on large language models and generative AI in general. We've done over a dozen so far this year, a couple of educational classes for, we're aligned with both, student organizations, done some executive work. Let me just make sure that looks right. That looks good. And so it's very much a community-driven thing. And so why this is relevant is I want to talk about how this connects back into, DevOps DFW. So we did a community event not too long ago at a major corporation here. And like a lot of companies, it's very secure. You want to get in and out of the facility. And so that evening, a number of people took time out from their evening when they could have done something else and showed up and helped us get through our process with Dallas AI. And we had well over 100 people, so it was very, very important they were there. And in talking to them, because I was standing out there as a volunteer in Dallas AI, I was standing out there in my Dallas AI shirt guiding people in the right direction. I found out that the people helping out, Naj, Paula, Sarab, I think several other people, Priyanka perhaps as well, were all part of DevOps DFW. And so I think it points to the strength of community that we all work together. Sarab even loaned me his identity for the evening. If this was a Sec DevOps conference, I wouldn't have said that. But Sarab, I want you to know that I'm here on my own identity and you won't get any bills. All right, so this is an easy question, and I doubt I'll see any arms down. But how many people have used at this point DALL-E, ChatGPT, Bard, go through any of the large language things that you want out there, Stability AI? How many of those have used it so far this year? And you're going to see basically that this is I actually was at a conference for HR a couple of months ago, and I asked that same question, almost all the arms went up. And so how many of you thought at that time you were contributing to an existential event for humans when you did that? Okay, so good. So you actually we've got an interesting cross-section of people here that would have a viable opinion on that. And so what I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to get into discussions in depth because that would be a much longer speech, but not to get into anything about the ethics or anything like that. What I'm going to talk about is that a lot of these problems that we see, and they're now very common to see press clippings where it's discussed. I come out of connected vehicles, so there's been a long-term discussion in autonomous vehicles about the ethics around that. So these are all questions that have all of a sudden become very real, even though it's 60 years since the concept of, say, neural networks was first invented. And so we've gone from a period where, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the hype cycle was about all the opportunities around it, and you couldn't find a CEO that didn't want to plant the magic bean of AI. And then now we've come to a point where people are now starting to think about the risk associated with bias and these other things. And if you put aside the existential component of it and just think about what's your expectation as a practitioner is, right? When you're going in and you're being asked to deliver systems. The one thing we always want to avoid is garbage in and garbage out. And the fundamental nature of statistical inference and algorithm use, and especially when you get into black box algorithms like neural networks, is not only do you have to be concerned about that garbage in process, the training, but if you're doing any kind of reinforcement, it's generating its own garbage and training itself again. And so this has started to shift the focus, I think, in a positive way. You can find any number of people to talk about, some with great intelligence and some without a lot of knowledge, about the ethics or the risk of AI. But what people don't really talk about is how do you effectively use it in a way that is safe and is going to be productive for your company and is ultimately going to be regulatory compliant. This is a bigger deal than people realize. So just out of curiosity, how many people are in finance or another regulated industry? So for an example, there are already regulations about using black boxes in decisions on creditworthiness. And even if you're not in finance, the GDPR is already looking at things around AI about how to extend the same discipline they now expect around our data into algorithms. So I like to focus on the positive aspect of this. And that's, and by the way, I highly recommend if you have an interest in both the humorous and dark side of the things that are happening with AI, both from an ethical perspective and from the sort of the reality of the day-to-day, is visit evilaicartoons.com. The reality is the ethical discussions have been going on for a long time. Evilaicartoons.com got started really around the discussion around automotive vehicles, right? Autonomous vehicles have a lot of ethics associated with them. And unfortunately, we don't have to speculate on how AI is going to kill somebody. Autonomous vehicles have already done that. But you have to kind of look at it with both a humorous perspective and one to kind of be thought-provoked. And so I highly recommend Evil AI Cartoons. That's where this cartoon that I've used here is from. And I think it gives you an interesting perspective and also a thought-provoking one as well, because it was tied to work done at MIT around the ethics of autonomous vehicles, but it's since gone further into that. So what we're really talking about at this point is we know we're going to use artificial intelligence. It's building on algorithmic use we've been doing for years. And so how do we come back in and put a structure around the process? And I think that's really where DevOps and what's been happening over the last several years is coming into play. If you think about it as a practitioner and AI, if you and I've got patents dating back for 10 years and have done work in a variety of environments with a variety of languages. But the hardest thing was not doing the models per se. Originally we started with very small data, and it was almost like a cottage feel to it in some ways. And actually, as I talk about this, data scientists still kind of prefer to operate that way. But as we've gotten at larger scale, and it's more critical to the business, we've had to come back and rethink a lot of these processes. And so you see, I talk about AI, DevOps, but I'm sure you've heard the term MLOps. And so this is obviously an area that the DevOps teams of companies are going to be continue to ask to extend themselves. More and more, this will be part of the process. I do not intend to cover every aspect of DevOps in detail, but I've picked some key areas here that I'd like to go through because I think it's beneficial and thought-provoking to look at this and communicate some of the things that you can be thinking about even in advance of if your company's doing or not, because William Gibson, the famous science fiction writer, once said, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." I'm not so sure with ChatGPT that's not true, but in the case of the maturity of using AI/ML in a DevOps or MLOps type environment, I think that's very true. There are industries where the companies, maybe for even as many as 50 or 60 years, the Fair Isaacs Corporation, Capital One basically went from being sovereign to Capital One in part because of its heavy reliance on statistical inference and predictive analytics. Those companies have a grasp of this. They've been working for a long time. But now we're seeing the footprint broaden, and there's been this huge democratization effort that we see with something like ChatGPT, where my neighbor who's in HR will give me hints. So we're going to cover these areas briefly. And I think at a top level, think of DevOps and then sort of underlying CICD as a macro environment for these things to happen in, because we've moved beyond the mad scientists, data scientists working in a room to the point that the scale's big enough, the retraining is necessary, that it has to be thought of as a more robust process, and that's what DevOps can provide. So let's talk about the elephant in the room anytime I work with my peers in the data science team. How many people think data scientists actually like Agile or DevOps? Any hands? Any data science here really love Agile or DevOps? Well, that's one of the challenges, I think, with incorporating data science into these delivery goals, is that with DevOps, you've got a certain amount of rigor, expectation, scalability you're expected to build into it. The data scientist is normally used to working alone. And so one of the parts of the process you have to go through in a big corporation is starting to move beyond this independent operation of your ML team, just doing things on their own and then sort of throwing them over the wall and expecting them to be integrated into these other systems. And a big part of that starts at the first process where you start thinking about how am I going to connect the data, do my ingestion, fulfill my data governance needs, begin to structure something that will fit into one or more applications that we're building. Because what I used to like to say to my teams at a previous company was, predictive analytics is only useful if the predictions get used. And so if you don't have it filled into that entire process of Agile and DevOps, you're not going to end up with a usable product at the end, either because the data science didn't fit into the actual demand from the end customer or end user, or because we couldn't make the 2 points meet. And how many of you have heard recently that OpenAI may have to do retraining on ChatGPT because their ingestion process included copyrighted material? And that's a really good example of what you're going to be seeing in the future. We're going to have to think about this front-end ingestion process and this inclusion for AML into Agile and DevOps as part of the overall process. It's no longer a series of handoffs. It'll have to have a real pipeline. So we've just referenced those inconsistencies that you'll find. And the other thing that's common with data is bias, because data is by nature historical. And so one of the examples I use that I've now had to modify in the last several years is, I talk about the United States. Normally when you think about coming in and doing an assessment of something with prediction in the United States, you might think about, I want to look at what men and women respondents would be. And so the distribution of men and women in the United States is not 50-50. So if you were looking for a perfect split, you'd have to adjust that bias in the data set. Now, we also have to include binary. And so you're breaking it into men, women, and non-binary, excuse me. And so that's another thought process you have to go through to think about what's going into the data process. And so when you start to think about this from a perspective of what is my job from a DevOps perspective, anytime I go through an iteration with a new set of data that's been changed, that has a different built-in characteristic, either from its original setting or from a change in the bias I'm inducing to fulfill my business goal, I'm going to be expected to be able to take that on and understand that. That has to be part of the process, much like we expect to be able to roll forward and roll back on systems. We're going to be expected to understand the data inputs, what version of that data we're using, what are the characteristics of that data, and how that feeds in the entire data acquisition and preparation process. And that's going to become very important because you're going to be expected at some point to be able to show that to auditors and potentially for regulatory reasons. So that's just the data point part. So let's talk about repeatability and observability. Observability is getting big for all systems, right? The idea that we can get a better idea of system behavior and understand the performance or characteristics or what's happening end to end with any system. But it's very important for models themselves, because invariably what you're producing originally is not going to be correct. And even if it's correct, as I'll cover later, it will eventually be wrong because the world will change. George Box, who is a lot of the statisticians and people that essentially became our early practitioners, were people that actually came out of other areas. So his training was not originally as a statistician, but became a very famous one. But he had a saying that's very true: all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And as part of the process you'll be going through is helping the ML team determine whether what they're delivering to the downstream users is actually useful or not. And so that's this idea that we're going to have this ability to go back and repeat what we're doing. We're going to have complete pipelines that will have to be synchronized that include the right data, the right algorithms, any of the hyperparameters we're using, et cetera, et cetera. And we're not going to be leaving this just up to the tool sets we have for DevOps. We're going to be adding tool sets like Kubeflow. If you use AWS, Azure, IBM, or any of the other systems, they have a set of tool sets for pipeline management. MLflow is for Databricks. So you'll be using these other tools. They're not really traditional CICD tools, but they fit into that overall process you're going to have to think about of release and management. And that's a key part of how you think about it. It's code changes that you've managed historically, but now you're also have to thinking about what is my data trail, who's touched that, what's the entire lineage process, and that's a little bit bigger box that DevOps can help with. So a lot of the early work that I was involved in at companies, again, as I've kind of referenced, it was very much the data scientist goes off and kind of does something in a corner. And data scientist is a relatively new term. And until 2018, basically, if you went in and looked at Aon and a lot of the HR systems, they still called them statisticians. And so that process was very isolated. A lot of times you didn't think about how you're delivering to your client. And it wasn't seen as a connected process. And the retraining was normally done by the practitioner. In other words, there was not expected to be an automated retraining pipeline. When you start to deploy large-scale models that go across multiple clients and multiple interfaces, this is no longer a viable approach. And so you have to start to cleanly separate out into production and look at how are you going to get to in a production process and then work through that process in the CI/CD and deployment phase where you will be able to support multiple clients, sometimes with wildly different characteristics and performance. I've been involved recently in deploying both web and app components. One of the apps is going into outside of the US. We're seeing different behaviors than we expected, not so much from the model, but from the client. But the end effect is the change is the same. It's impacting the adoption of the predictive analytics we're making because the age of the predominantly Android devices is so old that the responsiveness of the application is not sufficient. We wouldn't have known that, and if we hadn't done a little bit of early work and put it out into a smaller test set and kept the ML team informed that they were going to have to think about changing the number of recommendations and the overall dimension of the recommendations they were making because we were running into really a performance problem because there were a substantial body of older phones and older operating systems. Again, this is bread and butter for DevOps, working across all these different user interfaces. But it's relatively new for machine learning because, quite frankly, the practitioners haven't had to think about that aspect. And the other thing that happens with this is that predictive analytics, in too many cases, has been just outbound, not getting information on what was really happening later. And so we want to take that process to where we're actually looking and monitoring what's happened. And of course, this is where CI/CD comes in because as you monitor it, you have to be able to react to changes and look at your release process, do upgrades, and go through a process now, as I've described, as a much more complex group of applications and pipeline all working together. And so in this process, it's a little bit different from what we think of as doing an application. In some cases, the changes don't have anything to do with the application itself. It's what happened to reality. And so as part of the CI/CD process, we're going to have to look at what's happening outside of the things that we control, as well as things that normally would fall into our systems. And so as an example, with a recommendation, over time, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. The economics can change. An example of that kind of in abstract would have been what happened with the clients when we went outside the US for Android. You might get new model inputs, so you want to update your model and add new features. Obviously, software upgrades and changes to related independent systems are an important part of that. And then finally, one of the things that I think is not recognized by many people at this point, again, except some of the companies that are more advanced, is that when you make predictions and you provide feedback and you do these things either in batch or near real time, part of what will happen is the user behavior will change. Your reality will change. And, you know, a great example of that with ChatGPT is I have friends that treat it like it's a human being, you know, and chatbots the same way. So you have to start to accommodate for that. I noticed that ChatGPT did an upgrade, and now they like you to put in your information about what your background is, so it can, in my mind, seems like it's flattering you. Oh, you know, you've got this skill, and if you do this and do this, depending on what your prompt is, you know, you can help with this. And we'll kind of see this at the end here, because I'm going to let ChatGPT have the last word. But that's really important, because I can tell you that with putting out systems for both safety and for employee retention, early on, especially with the employee retention systems, we had a significant impact in improving employee retention. But at some point, the processes that we were proposing as part of the predictive analytics and the general mediation of people that were at risk for leaving the company, it improved the overall working environment. What happened? The quits went down. That was a goal, but it also made it hard to model for. And so success can cause you to have to rethink your process and go through another release process and an update of maybe all of the components, but certainly the model. So how do you identify that this is happening? Well, there's a key thing that doesn't get discussed a lot called ground truth. So when we make a recommendation, it's based on an analysis of historical data and a number of other factors. And it can be looking at other things, including not just the historical data of, say, a specific item that you could be recommending on, but also on, like, classic one you've seen in Amazon, on Netflix, excuse me, is product-to-product and person-to-person comparisons, where they look at what another person is buying that you might like, who seems to have similar characteristics, or they look at other products that have an association like that. How do you know if that's working or not? Well, the feedback loop is the ground truth. And so historically, this was something you kind of captured haphazardly, but over the last 5 years, this has become an implicit part of the modeling process. It's not necessarily well done at every organization, but increasingly, this is going to be the differentiator between deploying something and it being successful long-term, is because you're going to be working through the process of coordinating all these different components and taking in the feedback that occurs with the applications themselves that the people are using. So I'm curious, how many people, obviously there's probably Google Analytics and, you know, related systems that capture user interaction. How many of those are feeding, in the audience know that they're feeding that, are they feeding that back into their data science work right now? Just curious. So this is an area where DevOps is going to be very important, that's very underserved right now. And even in companies that have been doing this for quite a while, they're only getting to the point where they're thinking about automated retraining pipelines. This is sort of the area that goes from, you know, you've helped train ChatGPT if you participated in that. You're sort of the real-time pipeline for training there. So this starts to take it out of that larger context and put it in the context of your business. You know, even if it's, you know, something that's internal to your own staff, we make recommendations with some of the work that I do to CRM systems. So it's going to first a salesperson as opposed to an end customer, but we do both. And then it can also be feedback from sensor-based systems. Some of the connected IoT assets I've worked with provide a wealth of information on what's happening, connected vehicle specifically. And so that can be used along with human input to basically get a better idea of what's happening in current response to activities or recommendations that have been made or adjustments that you're making using models to systems as opposed to people. And as you've seen from the hand raises, this is something that's still relatively untapped that DevOps is going to be an incredibly important part of, because it's going to be part of the entire process and have to be managed. So has become sort of a standard at presentations. I went out to ChatGPT and asked about AI and DevOps, and what the risks were. And so ChatGPT told me in a somewhat flattering way, because it tends to now use you as opposed to, so like I was going to do it all by myself. But I thought it was very interesting that it did a good job of articulating the risk, but also goes through the critical domains, and it identified healthcare and autonomous vehicles. And this was, by the way, the last thing I did. I went back and did this. I wanted to put my slides together and then see what OpenAI said on DevOps. And so it's very clear that technical expertise is going to be key, but it's also going to be also more ethical considerations. And, if you're building ethical and unbiased systems, I think that DevOps is going to be a key part of this. And I'm already seeing that in my day-to-day work as we've gotten to larger scales and global scales. And it's an exciting area. It's MLOps, just like there's SecDevOps and these other things. All these sort of extensions of what have been done in DevOps are going to be needed. And so I think it's a great time to be joining forces, as I mentioned up front, with Dallas AI and what we're doing with DevOps DFW. And I'm thrilled to be presenting here. And thank you very much for your time. And please join us at a Dallas AI meetup. We actually take all disciplines as practitioners and come in and visiting. And we're doing some interesting meetups later in the year with completely non-AI related groups, not even technical, like the Dallas Producers Association, because as we've seen with the impact of ChatGPT, Midjourney and Discourse, Bard, OpenAI in general, it's touching a lot more areas now than it used to be. So hopefully you guys can join us. And now I'll take a few questions, either now or you can catch me later. Oh, thank you. Where do you meet? So it depends. So we have sometimes met at the Richardson Center over here. As I've mentioned, we've done meetups at multiple corporations, mostly in the Plano area. We don't go to Fort Worth. I know this because I live in Fort Worth, and I always drive over here for the events. And then, so largely it's been corporate facilities. We basically don't have a permanent home, but we typically draw 75 to 125 people for a given meeting. Some of the educational sessions are smaller than that, but typically for a bigger meetup, we'll run that range. And we're at LinkedIn, and we also have on the meetup page. And we run we've slowed down a little bit in the summer, but like in May, we ran 4 events. And so we're consistently running events. We actually started prior to COVID. Amar and Babar, the 2 founders, started it and then kind of maintained it virtually during COVID. And we went a little over a year ago now, we went back to face-to-face events. And it's a really great group of people. We've had a lot of very interesting and provocative of speakers, as well as a few events that were more about learning about specific products that are available in the AI community. Catch me later if you have any. Oh, got one out here. Yeah.
Can you give a definition of ground truth? I'm still a bit fuzzy on it.
Sure.
I've got users, I have my ground truth, but then input feeds back into it, and it becomes the ground truth.
Correct.
So it's like the ground is ever shifting.
Yes, and that's actually a really good way to put it. The world tends to change. So when you make a prediction, you're expecting a response. You're expecting the prediction to be used or not used. And I'm keeping it really simple. I'm not going into the difference between classification or regression, right? Because sometimes it's a number, sometimes it's an on or off condition, essentially. And so when you get that response, before you ever get to the point that you're kind of like, the release process you go through with anything, before you ever get to the point that you're deploying something to an end user, you're testing it, and the way you test it in AI and ML, using any kind of algorithm, no matter how old it is you go in and you cut out a test set, and you build your model with a training set that's separate from the test set, and then you go back, and once you've built your model, you see how it does against the test set. And so what's happening with ground truth is now you've got the model tuned as well as you think you can do with this data that you've got that's not reflective of, say, the most recent interaction with your end consumer. So now you go back and you're starting to provide those predictions to that end user, that end consumer, and they're doing things. They're ignoring things, they're selecting things, they're changing things. And so you have to go back and capture that entire process. I'm working with a basket of goods right now for what I'm doing. And so we capture, not necessarily for just data science metrics, but in general, if you make a recommendation of a good, it can be out of stock. The person, if it's like a B2B situation, it can be a situation where they're not allowed to purchase it, so you can't show it. There can be a condition where you've recommended it and the product's right, but the quantity's wrong. Or you can get it all wrong and it gets deleted. And so you have to capture all those interactions to go back and do model retraining. And the closer you can do that to near real time, the quicker you can do the model updates. And so while a lot of the batching is happening on the model side because you have to go capture the historical data from existing systems, as you move further into the model process and start to use DevOps, moving the items from the modeling out of the lab into the production area, that starts to become more near real time with the training process. And that's what everybody's moving toward, is this idea of more reinforcement training, where you're getting the ground truth quickly, be able to use it, and update the model quickly. Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, this question may be a little too trickier, so I apologize. I just asked Mark where DevOps Day was meeting this year, and it gave me what looks like the right response. How did it go?
So let me try to take a pass at this, because this is and I'm an algorithm applier, not an algorithm builder. So I didn't build any algorithms I use. So what happens with any kind of neural network is it's looking at, in the case of large language models, a large body. It's a million monkeys typing Shakespeare, right? It's looking at a large body of information that it's assumed to be correct, and then it's building a pathway through, with these millions and millions of network connections. And when you ask that question, it's picking a common path that it knows to go through. And so that's really good. It means that they've been continuing updating it, because that hasn't been up that long. Because wasn't here last year, was it? Yeah. So sometimes, and again, a lot of the data sets are limited, right? So if you look at what OpenAI has used, it's actually got a limited number of years. So the exciting thing is that we're moving in a world where you're going to be asked to stitch these pieces together so the data always gets updated. But it doesn't know anything until it gets this block of information that's relevant and goes through it, and it won't know anything about the future, even though it might be able to speculate about it based on what it's taken into the network. It's picking a path through its brain, much like you make decisions. And that's why the name neural network was coined 40 plus years ago for it, because it does somewhat follow the ideas that are used in the human brain. Not identically, but there's an analogous. Oh, wow, that's great. Black and white?
Yeah.
Good, that's the way I want it. Any final questions? I want to make sure, I know we were running a little bit behind, so I want to make sure that, good. Well, again, I want to emphasize the great thing about the community between DevOps D&W and Dallas AI, and please attend one of our events if you're so inclined. Thank you very much. Feel free to find me if there are any other questions.